BioCentury This Week is brought to you by IQVIA Biotech, a full-service CRO right-sized for biotech, dedicated to helping biotech leaders close unproductive gaps in clinical development so they can protect timelines, preserve capital, and stay ahead of risk.
Welcome to the latest edition of the BioCentury This Week podcast. Lilly is continuing to be active in the deal-making space, announcing its fifth major deal of the year, a $3.25 billion upfront payment for an in vivo CAR T company named Kelonia. We'll take a look at why Lilly is buying this company and how it's differentiated from another deal it recently did. And speaking of deals, last month gave T-cell engagers new credibility as a potential modality for B-cell depletion in autoimmune diseases. And from Washington, an executive order seeks to smooth the glide path toward approvals for psychedelic therapies. Meanwhile, in finance, Kailera, an obesity play with China roots, upsized its IPO late last week, which vaulted it to rare air, potentially one of the biggest ever biotech IPOs. And we'll remember Denis Lucquin, the father of French biotech. I'm Jeff Cranmer, host of the BioCentury This Week podcast, and joining me to discuss all of this are Editor-in-Chief Simone Fishburne, Executive Editor Selena Koch, Washington Editor Steve Usden, and the illustrious Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence. But first, right around the corner, Simone and Steve and a few of our other colleagues will be flying off to Prague to enjoy a beautiful city and the premier Biotech CEO and Investor Conference, which is now in its 26th year. Speaking of Denis, Denis and his partner Antoine at Sofinnova helped BioCentury by being the inaugural sponsor of this event. They always championed this event. And, well, it's one of the reasons why bioequity is what it is today. Simone, are you getting excited? You got your scene setter stuff already baked?
Am I ever excited? First of all, I want you to know that I'm now deeply immersed in reading loads of books set in Prague. You know, Milan Kundera comes to the fore. Yeah, having a good time with that. But
what's your favorite Milan Kundera?
What is my favorite?
Yeah.
Ask me in a couple of weeks when I've read a few more of them. Right now, I'm on Lightness and Being.
Keep it unbearably light, Simone.
Yeah. Anyway, yes, I'm also extremely excited about the scene setter analysis that I'm doing, which I will talk a little bit more about when I've just done a little bit more work on it. But broadly, we are looking at clinical trials, in particular phase 1 globally and within Europe, where they're being done and who's doing them and in what disease areas and where the different hotspots and strengths are. So it's really, shaping up to be very interesting. And as I said, we'll talk more about that.
The need for speed. It's going to be a great event. We have a great lineup of 100 presenting companies from across Europe. A few slots left, so if you're interested, reach out to me or my colleague Tim Tulloch. And if you're interested in attending, jump right in. There are pre-event excursions still available. And there will be lots of networking. If you're looking to get in front of investors in Europe, this is the conference to do it. All right, Eli Lilly, deal number 5. It seems like it's a race between Eli Lilly and Gilead this year to see who can have the most big-time deals. Lauren has been following most of them for us, along with our colleague Paul Bonanos. In this deal, well, it's once again putting its obesity earnings to work, building out its pipeline. Not quite as big as the Centessa deal that we recently talked about. That was $6.3 billion. This, again, as I said, is $3.25 billion. Potential to get up to $7 billion. That's the BioBuck number. Lauren, what set this company apart from the others and inspired Lilly to pull the trigger?
So if I had to guess, I think it would probably be the fact that Kelonia has some of the longest durability data for any in vivo CAR Ts that we've seen so far. And we haven't seen a lot of clinical data, and it's not a lot of durability data. But at ASH, at the end of last year, we saw data from 4 patients. I think one of them had about 5 months of follow-up, and efficacy still looks strong at that point. And so that's kind of the most that we're getting right now. And I think when it comes to what people want to see for these in vivo CAR T platforms, durability is kind of everything, safety and durability. But that's kind of the yet unknown out there right now, especially when you're talking about applying these to cancer. So you mentioned that this was Lilly's second deal, I think, for an in vivo CAR T company this year, just about 2 months after they announced the acquisition of Orna. What's different here is that was an RNA-based technology to create in vivo CAR Ts. This is a lentivirus-based technology. I think we're still also waiting to see how these two different, and there are others, how these different mechanisms for creating these in vivo CAR T cell therapies really plays out in the clinic. I think there's some speculation that maybe the lentivirus will be more durable and something that can be applied to cancer. Maybe the mRNA will be something that, is faster acting and can be applied to autoimmune diseases. I don't think we know that yet, but this does give Lilly 2 different shots at the in vivo CAR T mechanism.
Lauren, this space is obviously just getting hotter and hotter. I know that there have been a few sort of setbacks on the way, here and there, patient death, and also some, what you've pointed to in durability. I'm just sort of wondering, we've seen a few deals in this. Is this becoming something that farmers need to have in their stable? They need to have an in vivo CAR T, or has it not reached that kind of point yet?
I think it's reaching that point. I think the data speak for themselves. We've seen quite a few acquisitions and just broad partnership deals around these technologies. It's still early. There's still limited clinical data. And I think this is the time when people want to get in and not have to invest a ton, although this deal obviously is a big investment. But if this technology works as people are hoping it will work, then yes, these farmers want to be in here. CAR T cell therapies, ex vivo CAR Ts, are incredibly effective. And that limiting factor is the delivery and the manufacturing and all of that. This takes away so much of that complexity. If this is as effective and as an ex vivo CAR T, it's something that could be more effective than a T cell engager, for example. If the efficacy and the durability and the safety, which there could be safety advantages here over the ex vivo too, if they play out, then this could be a huge game changer in cancer, but also in autoimmune diseases as well. So it's still early, but I think it's the time that companies want to get in.
Lauren, on the durability front, and people do say this, durability is sort of everything, right? But if these are off the shelf and if they're, say, a bit safer, couldn't you just redose? Is it so absolute as durability has to be as long?
That's a really good question. I think that certainly with an mRNA-based approach, you have the opportunity to redose, and that's something that the companies are looking into. I think it's kind of an open-ended question when you come to the viral vector-based strategies, because there's always the risk for an immune response, like we've seen with AAV gene therapies, redosing is a challenge. So I'm not exactly sure how that will play out in the future.
I have another question, Lauren. Most of what we've seen so far is in the same cancers as CAR Ts, so multiple myeloma, the other blood cancers. Just wondering if you think that this will have more chance of expanding into other indications and, what the time frame might be. Have people talked about that?
I haven't heard too much about that. I think there's so much technology risk here that going after CD19 and BCMA and maybe CD20, that's the obvious place to go. So we mentioned the differentiation on manufacturing. There's potentially a safety advantage here too, because you take out the lymphodepletion aspect, which adds a huge amount of toxicity to the ex vivo CAR T cell process. So I don't know how that can help translate to other tumor types. Like the solid tumor challenges are the solid tumor challenges. It's an antigen problem. And I don't know exactly how an in vivo CAR T cell therapy could address that, but I'm sure people are thinking about it.
Okay, and this deal, according to BioCentury's BCIQ database, is the largest ever takeout for a private venture-backed biopharma, and it tops the Tubulus deal that we talked about literally just last week, and that was Gilead, as I teased at the top, $3.15 billion buying the antibody drug conjugate company out of Germany, Tubulus. Let's head over to T-cell engagers. Now, there's been quite a few deals lately. This is bumping up the credibility of TCEs in autoimmune diseases. And Lauren did one of her classic deep dive analysis decks. And, well, what did you learn? What really jumped out at you, Lauren?
As background, as you said, the reason that we were looking into this is because we saw a couple of deals for T-cell engagers for autoimmune diseases recently. And I think it's just kind of this field is at a tipping point. And the question that those deals raised for me was, we have T-cell engagers for cancer. These are a well-established, for heme cancers. This is a well-established modality. They're effective. The same therapies can be applied to autoimmune diseases, but do we want the same therapies for cancer and for autoimmune diseases? And what are the different properties that may make something safer and more effective if you're applying it in a different setting? What I found in looking through the data, the pipelines and the deals, is that it's pretty split between programs that companies are repurposing or pivoting from cancer, T-cell engagers that were developed specifically for cancer and now are being used in autoimmune applications, and those that were developed specifically to treat autoimmune diseases. The main difference when you're looking at these two different disease areas is safety and durability, maybe, but mostly safety. So if you're treating a cancer where survival times are relatively short, there's a lot of flexibility on the adverse events that may be tolerated in a therapy that gets approved. If you're treating a chronic autoimmune disease, the bar for safety just goes way up. And so what's been happening in the cancer space is companies are already trying to make the T-cell engagers safer. They found that if you change the arm of the antibody that binds CD3 and binds a T-cell, activates the T-cell, and lower its affinity for that CD3, the safety profile is better, the efficacy is comparable. So the whole field has been moving in this direction of making safer T-cell engagers for cancer. And the thought is that we probably can repurpose this and have this be something that's safe enough to treat an autoimmune disease, especially if there's some tweaking of the dosing and the dose schedule. The hope is that when you have a T-cell engager for autoimmunity, you may be able to dose once or just do one cycle of treatment to knock down the B cells that are causing a problem, the autoreactive B cells, and reset the immune system. That was the first finding, that it's really split between trying to take the safer T-cell engagers that are being developed for cancer, maybe not the first generation ones, and apply those to this new setting, and then developing sort of fit for purpose antibodies.
Okay, so that's the safety side. Let's talk a little bit about the efficacy side. You have this nice diagram in there that kind of shows that even though these are some cases the same therapies or therapies against the same targets, like the tissue environment in the B-cell driven cancer versus the autoreactive B-cell tissue is just different. And that can also influence the drug properties that you're seeking. Can you talk a little bit about, for instance, proliferation rates are really high in cancer, right? So maybe the absolute number of diseased B cells are a lot higher in that setting. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So we mentioned that safety was really important when you're taking these into autoimmune diseases. I think naturally you could use the same therapy and there may be just a better safety profile if you're treating an autoimmune disease, because the whole idea here is that we should have said this at the beginning, you're using a T-cell engager to direct T cells to kill B cells, whether those are cancerous B cells in a heme cancer or B cells that are autoreactive in an autoimmune disease patient. And so cancerous patients, as you mentioned, they have a huge proliferation of B cells. So you're having a ton of T cell activity and inflammation, and that leads to some of the inflammatory side effects that happen in those settings. For autoimmune diseases, the B cells are targeting the wrong thing, but they're not proliferating like they are in cancer. You have a relatively normal number of B cells. So from the start, that you won't have the same level of inflammatory toxicities, or at least that's what's expected.
Would it also make it easier to achieve the efficacy that you want because you don't have to eliminate as many of the B cells?
Well, that's the hope. And the other hope is that, the expectation is that there's a threshold of how much of the B cell population you need to eliminate to have the therapeutic effect that you want to have in an autoimmune disease. In cancer, you can't leave any cancerous cells behind because they'll just, grow again and the patient will relapse. In autoimmune disease, the hope is that if you can get rid of enough of the autoreactive B cells, you're actually able to reset the immune system and bring it back to a naive B cell state. And those cells will then not react to whatever the autoantigen was that they were reacting to. So there is this thought that maybe we don't need to be as effective. We probably don't have to be as durable. You don't need something like sitting around and being surveillance for any cells that snuck by.
So like you said in the slide deck, there's a whole lot of promise. I think you just listed at least 3 really big reasons why it makes sense to reposition over here to autoimmunity. I think you also said this bolus of activity recently is more on the promise than on the data. Like what's the state of the field? Are we expecting milestones?
The state of the field is that there's relatively little clinical data supporting the use of T-cell engagers in autoimmune diseases. We do have clinical data supporting CAR T-cells against these same targets in autoimmune diseases. We've seen that CAR T-cells can reset the immune system. And the whole idea is that a T-cell versus an antibody, like rituximab, can get into the tissues and find those B cells that antibodies can't reach, which you sort of stay in the circulation more. The hope here is that a T-cell engager can draw the T cells to the tissues, and the T cells can then penetrate the tissue better and have a CAR T-like effect. But we've only seen data from like a limited number of patients. There's been some Blincyto results that have looked really promising. I think it's like 6 patients with rheumatoid arthritis who have indications that you may be seeing some sort of an immune reset. And we've heard from a couple other companies that they do have positive data. We just have seen some top line results. What we will see this year is a few programs that are scheduled to read out in multiple indications. We have, I think, 3 different indications from Cullinan for CLN 978. That's going to be in lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and Sjogren's disease. And they'll have a second therapy that also reads out soon. And I think we'll see data from others as well. We just haven't necessarily been told exactly when that will be this year.
Lauren, 2 things. First of all, I really recommend subscribers see this deck. It is an amazing deck. It's really interesting. I kind of got deep into it. I just wanted to call out one thing that surprised me and one thing that didn't. Okay. And on the surprised me front, you talked a little bit about what data we have, but on the early preclinical part of the spectrum, there's really so much innovation, not just there's a certain number of targets and combinations of targets that people are going for, but then there's also a lot of different structures. So you've got co-stimulatory receptors, you've got bispecifics with co-stimulatory receptors, you've got trispecifics. And so it feels like there's a lot of modularity in here. And I understand that there's a lot of indications you could go for, but I've tended to think about this as fairly restricted number of targets that you could go for B-cell depletion. But it seems that people are going different ways about it. So that's, I don't know if you've got a comment about that. That's I was surprised. And the not so surprised was the amount of activity in China. So why wouldn't I be surprised? Because that's just this recurring theme, right? Especially in this space. And so a fair number of deals, I think, are cropping up in this space with a fair number of innovators from China. Any thoughts about those, Lauren?
Well, I wanted to quickly jump in and just say, it's very fitting with the trend we're seeing that a lot of the low-hanging fruit, late-stage assets in China are now gone. Companies are moving way upstream. So just looking quickly at this brilliant table that Lauren put together of about, 9 deals, most of which are in China, almost all are preclinical. That about right, Lauren? Did you want to jump in there too?
That looks right. And yes, this is a trend that we're seeing a lot of. And Simone, back to your first point, something I noticed about a lot of these preclinical stage programs and the ones that look more innovative, that are, the tri-specifics, the ones that are targeting two antigens or the ones that have a co-stimulatory receptor. Those are often designed specifically for autoimmune diseases, which I thought was interesting. And a lot of those are coming from biotechs in China as well. Yeah, it's all in the deck, and it's really interesting to get into how companies are picking the indications for these. The target list is limited. There's just 3 main targets, but they each have their own place, and there isn't a lot of proof of concept yet, but we have ideas of where they'll work and what will be enough in each indication. And it's all a really interesting strategy. And I've spoken with some companies about how they're going about it, and that will be in a future story. But I'm looking forward to seeing how that works out in the clinic.
And the buyers, some interesting names. Though no surprise, Gilead was in on the biggest deal with Oro. The upfront is by far and away the largest among these, $1.7 billion. That was in March. And then Sanofi, UCB, Boehringer, Otsuka, Cullinan, as Lauren mentioned, Prolium, and then Ken Song's Candid connected with Rally Bio to get a BCMA CD3 TCE. That, I think, is the most advanced, Lauren, or sort of neck and neck with the Gilead program that it's getting?
I think so. Candid has some clinical data, but we've only seen the top line results so far.
All right. Well, great piece, obviously, from Lauren. If you're not a subscriber, this one might tip the scales for you. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and talk about the latest executive order affecting drug development and regulation.
BioCentury this week is brought to you by the 26th Bioequity Europe in Prague, Czech Republic. Innovators everywhere are seeing speed as the driver of investment, partnering and success. Speed to the clinic, speed to early human data, speed to de-risk assets. The question for European biotechs is clear. How do you compete in this arena? Facing new momentum from Asia and an unpredictable landscape in the US, the science in Europe is there. There are more experienced operators. And investor sentiment finally is turning. What's needed now is speed. In its 26th edition, Bioequity Europe travels to Central and Eastern Europe for the first time to explore emerging opportunities in the region and debate how European biotech can accelerate to compete and lead in today's world. Join us in Prague, May 4th to 6th, for this destination event for investors and biopharma leaders. Register at bioequityeurope.com. Bioequity Europe, where Europe accelerates to compete.
Okay, and well, you heard it from that fine young man there. Go to Bioequity Europe in Prague. We've already sold you on the beer and the history and the literature, and now we're ready to sell you on the biotech. Shouldn't be too hard. Okay, Steve, executive order out either last night or today. What's in it?
First, I have to say I like the idea, go for the beer, stay for the biotech. What's in it? It accelerates the development of psychedelic therapies. It instructs the FDA commissioner to grant commissioners national priority vouchers to appropriate psychedelic drugs that have received a breakthrough designation and comply with criteria of the voucher program. This is notable. It's prescriptive language. It doesn't merely permit FDA to issue CNPVs to psychedelics. It directs them to do that. It allocates $50 million in federal funds to ARPA-H for state-level psychedelic research investments. This is basically intended to provide matching funds that will enable a program in Texas for studying ibogaine, if that's how you pronounce it. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. And separately, it instructs HHS, FDA, and VA to increase clinical trial participation and data sharing. Here's the key thing. Another key thing also is it creates a right to try pathway for psychedelics, again, specifically also for ibogaine or ibogaine. This is new. It's never worked before. There's never been a possibility really of using right to try for psychedelics. That was tried in the past, and it was legally blocked by the Ninth Circuit in 2025, which said that the Right to Try Act didn't create an exemption from DEA's Controlled Substances Act. That's another big change in this order.
Steve, it's almost as if somebody in the administration has a particular interest in this area.
Yeah, so what's the background here, Steve? Why now?
But let's just go to precedent. I mean, obviously, this kind of thing has been done in cancer, I assume, picking out a specific area for favor. And I think that, and Selena might talk to this in a minute, there's no question about the unmet need in this particular area. But do either of you see any, potential risks associated with this kind of a policy from the White House in this way?
Yeah, I see a lot of them. But first, I want to correct one thing. This is unprecedented. There's never been an executive order before that has done anything like this. There have been executive orders that in a general way have said, accelerate cancer drugs or accelerate research into treatments for opioid abuse or something like that. But there's never been one that's been this prescriptive and this specific, right? And the other thing is that the process, the backstory behind this is extraordinary. So there's the podcaster, Joe Rogan. He said that he sent a text to the president touting 80% cure rates for opioid addiction from Ibogaine treatments. And he said that the president texted him right back and said, oh, this is a great idea. FDA is going to do it. And then a day or two later, they have this ceremony at the White House to which Joe Rogan is invited, which lends credence to his comments on this. The administration hasn't pushed back and said that what he said wasn't true. That creates an appearance of political motivation, including the possibility that the White House is attempting to offset Rogan's criticism of the Iran war. At the White House ceremony, Marty Makary, the FDA commissioner, kind of gave a little bit more credence or weight to some concerns that maybe that the administration and FDA has already decided what it's going to do, and it's going to put pressure explicit or implicitly on FDA reviewers. One of the things that Makary said, he said, the stories of individuals who have taken these drugs are dramatic. He said, this is a quote, the stories of those individuals with dramatic results, that is data. That is scientific data, even from a single individual. Well, that's not really the traditional definition of data, right? In fact,
it's absolutely not data. It's datum, but it's certainly not data.
Or possibly an anecdote.
Yes, exactly. The idea that the plural of anecdotes is data is not one that's usually taught in medical school. Then he also talked about, which is interesting also, then Makary also talked, he said, well, we have randomized controlled trials, and we have to do those because, they're a good idea. And if you look at those trials, there's a 30 to 40% remission rate for conditions like PTSD. Well, the interesting thing there is that if you look at the numbers and you look at what he said, it seems to be that he's talking about Lykos's MDMA trials, which interestingly enough, in 2024, an FDA advisory committee voted 10-1 against approving, and then FDA subsequently issued a complete response letter for. All of this strikes me as being kind of seat of the pants and trying to push things through, which is problematic both because these are really serious conditions and they're really serious drugs, which actually may have promise, but they need to be developed in a careful way. We've talked on this podcast before, and Selena has a lot of knowledge about all of the complexities of doing clinical trials with psychoactive drugs. But then there's the bigger issue also, which this kind of reinforces the narrative that I've heard from biopharma CEOs and lobbyists in Washington increasingly over the last couple of months, which is that if companies want to maximize their chances of getting their drugs to market, they have to have not only a clinical strategy, not only a regulatory strategy, but they need a political strategy. They need to be able to have some kind of political influence in the White House or at FDA or with Secretary Kennedy to make their drug approval go smoothly. The Commissioner's National Priority Voucher Program reinforces this idea because the commissioner or in this case, it seems the president can pick things out and say, well, these are the things that we're going to give a big push to. And by the way, create a competitive advantage against other company.
And just to remind the listeners who may not have thought that at the moment, but obviously 2024 was a different person's FDA. I think that just adds to this feeling of what FDA said and ruled previously may not hold now and just contributes to the continued uncertainty. That's just at a broader level, That was then, this is now.
And more changes coming. Oh, go ahead, Selena.
So I can't speak to the Ibogaine data. I haven't followed that as closely. I'm not sure if there's large, well-done randomized controlled trials there.
Just quickly, so FDA announced in conjunction with this White House meeting that they were clearing the first IND for Ibogaine. So Here you have the president and you have the FDA commissioner asserting that we have a product that actually could have tremendous therapeutic potential. And there hasn't even been a phase 1 trial conducted in the United States of it.
So this is when you need really strong scientific and regulatory institutions. Then you need to let them do their job. But anyway, what I can speak to, like the companies who are most advanced with psychedelics, who this might advantage, right? So we have Compass Pathways, has 2 positive phase 3 trials with a psilocybin analog in depression. And does that drug have potential? I mean, both trials were positive, so it's a replicable result. But when the first phase 3 read out, it lost 49% of its stock value that day because the magnitude of the benefit was basically right at that minimum bar for clinical meaningfulness. So the standard rating scale, excuse me, for depression trials, right? The Montgomery-Åsberg depression rating scale, it's a 60-point scale. It moved it 3.6 points versus placebo. So around 4 points, that's kind of generally accepted as you're just meeting the threshold for having a real effect there. So, the stock tanked. Then they had a second phase 3 readout this year. And in that case, they did something that's really good because it's so hard to keep these trials actually blinded because these are powerfully psychoactive and people generally know if they got the treatment or placebo, right? So the way that reputable companies like Compass are trying to navigate that difficult road is by testing a dose that is perceptible, barely perceptible, but far below what's thought to be therapeutic instead of placebo. So you can also have that comparison because it makes it some people in the placebo group or the control group think that they're probably getting treatment, right? And so that phase 3 read out and it was also positive. And the good news was that the result didn't get any smaller. So it was also about a 3-point something. I think that one was 3.8 change. Okay, so that was good. It regained some of its share value. It's moving forward. It plans its NDA this year. I mean, that just goes to show you, like, there probably is some benefit with this class. We definitely need new treatments in these disease areas. There's no doubt about that. But the hype around it, the language around the transformative potential and just going to be more effective than anything that's come before it is like, I don't know. I think we should just let the regulators do their job, right? And
I think it's just a really important point because I just want to make it very clear. It's not that we at BioCentury have a position against this class of drugs, right? The skepticism is not from the potential of the drugs. I think it's really more looking at the process and this, Selena, you've talked and you've just said some nice things about Compass. It puts so much responsibility on the companies pushing these drugs forwards to do the trials the right way. You talk about the regulators doing their jobs. The companies have to be adhering responsibly, creating data that investors, that most of all physicians and patients can rely on, rather than looking at a glide path that might have been created for them in and of itself. They should not be short-circuiting.
And that's precisely short-circuiting and creating glide paths is precisely what this executive order is intended to do. And it's precisely what the language around the White House, what Marty McCary was talking about, and creating this right to try pathway, which is going to create a lot of, the most positive way to look at it would be it's going to create a lot of real-world data. I think the most likely thing is it's going to create a lot of selective anecdotal data. Everybody who thinks that they benefited from it, and maybe people really did benefit from it, is going to come forward. Whether we're going to hear from the people who didn't benefit from it is less likely. Again,
so Steve, quick question here for you. Do payers have a role here? Might they be the ones to require a higher standard of data? Or do you think not for these drugs? How do you look at that?
Well, of course, payers are going to have a point of view. It's notable that Mehmet Oz, the administrator of CMS, was at that White House meeting. The order directs the Veterans Administration to work closely with these companies. So I think that the implication is that at least on the VA side and on the CMS side, and they're going to be big payers for these kinds of products, they're aligned with the push to get them through and to get them reimbursed. So they do seem to be looking at this both from the smoothing the path, the regulatory path to get approval, and the reimbursement side. And again, I think that the two issues that I would bring up, I think that are the most salient beyond psychedelics is the level of concern around having political influence or podcaster influences on regulatory decisions and the influence that might have on FDA reviewers.
Not all podcasts, Steve. They should be listening to this one, right?
So, Steve, staying with FDA, we now have a candidate to replace Vinay Prasad as CBER director. Can you give us a quick take?
Yeah, so there are multiple candidates who are in play. That's what I've heard. I've also heard from some individuals who've said that they've been approached to take the job and that they either declined themselves or that they were informed later by the administration that they were no longer under consideration. But the leading candidate seems to be Homan Hemati. And again, I apologize if I've mispronounced the name. He seems to be clearly to be Marty McCary's top choice for the job. What I'm hearing is that the actual final sign-off on this is going to rest with Chris Klump, the HHS chief counselor, who's overseeing day-to-day operations at HHS. Hemati doesn't have any experience at FDA or in government. He does have a lot of experience as a scientist and in drug development. He worked on clinical programs at Allergan. He was VP of Medical and Clinical Development for New Therapies at Capricor Therapeutics. And in parallel with these roles, he's been a biotech entrepreneur and holds part-time positions at several companies that are developing ophthalmic drugs. His appointment would, if he gets a job, would mark a continued break from decades of precedent in which center directors have always been nonpartisan scientific leaders with deep agency experience and honestly very low profiles, right? Prior to the second Trump administration, FDA center directors really considered themselves to be civil servants. They avoided making public statements about controversial or political issues. Hemati is very politically active. He's got a profile that's unlike any other previous center director. He's frequently on Fox News and other conservative media, most recently talking in support of President Trump's actions in Iran. He's leader of an organization that's seeking the recall of California Governor Gavin Newsom. So to me, the relevant point really isn't what his political positions are. It's the fact that he has them and he's so politically active and vocal. And then to think that somebody who's been so politically active and vocal would go into what's essentially a civil service job is unusual. Over the last few days, he's posted on X stating that politics and health should be kept separate. So it seems to be an effort to address these concerns.
Steve, I'm going to have to stop you there. We want to save some time to talk about what could be one of the largest or the largest biotech IPO ever after Kailera upsized its IPO. I'm still waiting to see if they closed the green shoe. They raised $625 million late Thursday. The stock then traded up 63% to lift its market cap above $3.3 billion. Now, if the underwriters exercise their overallotment, that'll bump them up to nearly $720 million, which knocks Sana out of the top spot. What do you think about these guys here, Simone? That's quite an achievement.
Yes, it's quite an achievement. The first thing I think, Jeff, as I said to you the other day, is wow, they grow up so fast. It feels like only yesterday that Kailera was on our newcos being spun out of China, to create new companies in the West. And here they are with the biggest IPO ever. But let's just put a couple of things in context. We are talking about the field of obesity, and we are talking about a company that is now it's got phase 2 data and it's now looking to start phase 3. That's a very different color of company than the, crazy IPOs of a few years ago on preclinical data and so on. What I'm really trying to say is there's very good reason for this amount of money. They have good clinical data. They have good clinical differentiation, and they are in a therapeutic area with very, very significant market size where there's room for a lot of players kind of thing. So I do think that if you were actually going to paint a picture of a company that would have the biggest IPO, this is probably the one that you'd pick.
I agree with you there. And then the timing worked. We heard from Guggenheim's James Lee, who said that they kind of got out right when sentiment greatly improved last week after the initial ceasefire, or maybe that was 2 weeks ago. But that ceasefire's fragile. Nerves are, well, it's.
Don't get me started on the ceasefire, okay?
I got you, Simone.
Maybe
In the context of the IPO market, it's making an already tricky situation trickier.
right.
Leave it at that. I do want to give a hat tip to Jiangsu Henri, one of the bigger players in the NewCo model that we've been following. That is where this asset has come from. And Henri is, and I'm probably butchering that. I'm going to have to double down on my Chinese lessons. They still own a fairly sizable amount in Kailera. I think they're still around, let's see, they were at 14% going into the offering.
Jeff, can I just give another little shout out here? Because
Sure.
we got the big splashy Kailera one, but there was another IPO last week for Alamar, right? And that's a post money of over $1 billion. Thank you very much. And I don't really want to call it Little Alamar because that's really only next to Kailera. But
Yeah.
I mean, that is a developer of proteomics tools for biomarker profiling and analysis. So what does that tell you? Not only that maybe the IPO window is opening, but look at where money is going. Biomarker profiling, proteomics. These are maybe the terms of this next era. Somebody thinks that they can make money with that technology. And, you know, that had some good underwriters, JP Morgan, BofA Securities, Cowen, Leerink, Stifel. So, you know, I really think that we are looking at the IPO queue. Seaport's in there. EMAB Therapeutics in there. We'll probably talk a little bit more about that on future pods, I expect.
Yeah, don't sleep on Odyssey, led by Gary Glick. That company, file it under They Grow Up So Fast as well, Simone. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't give a shout out to Revolution Medicines, pricing the second largest follow-on ever for a NASDAQ traded biotech.
And well deserved on some incredible data.
Yeah, pancreatic cancer.
The RAS.
So 1.75 billion. I wanted to take a quick minute before we go to pay tribute to one of biotech's all-time greats, Denis Lucquin. He was an architect of Sofinova Partners, a founding father of French biotech, and one of the most important figures in the growth of Europe's biotech ecosystem. He passed away earlier this month. He was a trusted advisor to his CEOs, a mentor to his colleagues, and a champion of his companies in and out of the boardroom. His presence was critical to the development of a generation of biotechs throughout Europe. BioCentury's remembrance of Denis can be found in the show notes or on biocentury.com, and that is open access. Well, thanks for hanging with us. We went a little longer today. We had a lot to discuss, which, if you're in biotech, you know that's a good thing. Lots of news, lots of deals, financings, data. You can go to our website to check out our AACR data, including a great story on dual load ADCs by Lauren. And we'll have more coverage this week. A thank you to Kendall Square Orchestra, as ever, for providing the music for BioCentury this week. And we'll have a special podcast later this week with Kyle Bryan, CMO from our sponsor, IQVIA Biotech. And we'll be talking a bit of AACR on that.
BioCentury would like to thank IQVIA Biotech for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about how IQVIA Biotech's dedicated teams deliver support from innovation to impact, visit IQVIAbiotech.com.